Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Yesterday we were in the middle of a Torah Tmima, but there were other questions that were raised, and I would like to finish the Rashi on this. And so we're going to talk about, this is where this man, quote, quote, wrestles with Jacob at night. He's by himself. And according to what we were reading, he went back to clean up the campsite, you might say. There were small jugs that were left there, and while he was by himself, he wound up wrestling with this angel until dawn. So here we go. We had this interpretation of vaYishlach, that to interpret it at first of as avak dust. This is one of Rashi's teachers, and Rashi disagrees respectfully, and he has actually the word avak. This root has to do with being entangled, because when you wrestle with someone, basically you grab hold of them and you wind up getting entangled. So let's see if we've got this. Right. So we actually did finish this, as I now recollect, Vishurazal Shehu Sarosh Esav, that the idea is that this was actually Esau's guardian angel. And just a couple of notes. I'm sure you've heard, like commonly expressed, that everyone has a guardian angel, but here we actually read that we do have, each one of us has a guardian angel. And again, this whole concept of guardian angel is one that's not so simple and requires further explanation and meditation and thought about it. The fact that he was wrestling with Esau's guardian angel and in the light of some of the things that we discussed, Harlan raised it yesterday, that perhaps this is a way of expressing very deep inner wrestling that Jacob was having with himself. And in this idea, it occurred to me that quite possibly there were elements of Esau within Jacob. We talked yesterday, Lauren mentioned that some of the things we hate most about other people are actually things that are deeply embedded in ourselves, and that we tend to transfer in that way the self-hatred onto other people. I wonder if that has to do with it too. Because as I mentioned yesterday, this is a watershed moment for Jacob and his life, the way he conducts his life, basically, for the rest of the time. The rest of his life is different from how he behaved up to this point. Excuse me. So I think that the idea of having these sorts of, in some ways, puzzling, challenging statements is there precisely so that we'll think about it and think more deeply and perhaps gain a better understanding ultimately. So we'll go back to the Torah Tmima at this point and see what he wants to say. So this is where we were yesterday. Yesterday in the Torah Tmima, we were discussing the fact that Rashi says that he put Dinah in a box. It's based on the fact that it talks about his 11 children, and he actually had 12 children. Benjamin was not born at the time, but at least we know for a fact, based on the text, that he had 12 children. And the Torah Tmima goes into discussing why Dafka Dinah, just his children, and comes up with potential proof of why it had to be Dinah, and then talks about how Rashi's interpretation that he didn't want Esau to wind up marrying Dinah, and that possibly she would, in fact, turn him to the good side, which I think in some ways is very helpful if we look at his wrestling with the guardian angel of Esau, and we interpret it in the way that I was trying to interpret. And now we're going to... Yes.
Rabbi,
yes.
When they were wrestling, the divine person broke Abraham's hip, and I know my mother, she never buys the thing on the hip anymore. because of Jacob. I said, why? I don't understand it either.
We haven't gotten to that verse yet.
Right, that's correct, Harlan. So you're anticipating, and we'll get to it eventually, God willing. We still, hopefully, we'll make it by the end of the week. We'll have discussed that. Okay? So I want to stay on topic, and so we're going to go on with this. V'od yesh ledakdek b'pasuk haniskar. And the Torah Tamima says we need to look further and analyze this verse that we just were talking about. And this is in 23, Vayikach et shtei nashav ve'et shtei shivchotav, that Jacob, he took his 2 wives and his 2 handmaidens, ve'et achadasar yeladav, and his 11 children, right? We were discussing the Dina issue based on that. Lefi ma shekatuv Rashi la'el, especially in the light of what Rashi writes above the Parsha Vayetze, in the previous Parsha of Vayetze, and it's chapter 31, verse 17. Vayakom Yaakov, Jacob arose, Vayisa et banav ve'et nashav, and he took along his sons and his wives. Hikdim zacharim lenekevot. This is Rashi's point, that if you look at the verse, the sons, the males, come before the females. Aval Esav, and this again Rashi continuing, Aval Esav hikdim nekevot lezacharim. But Esau preceded the females to the males. Shinemar, how do we know that? Chapter 36, verse 6, Vayikach Esav et nashav ve'et banav. It says specifically that Esau took his wives and his sons. Ad kan lashono, that's the end of the quote from Rashi. Umevoar b'midrashim, and it is explained in the midrashim. Demipnei shahaya Esav shatuf bezima. The reason why he preceded his wives before his sons is because he was so carried away, Esau was so carried away with obscenity and lust and those kinds of things. Hayu lo nashav ikar, and for that reason he considered his wives more important. Now, it's a particular interpretation, but you'll see where we go with this. Okay, so it's saying that literally, from a literary position, the Torah is trying to make that suggestion in comparison, in contrasting and comparing the way in which it describes Jacob and Esau, and one putting their sons before their wives and the other putting their wives before their sons, etc. He says, well, based on that explanation, we have a major problem here. Dichtiv gam b'Yaakov Cain, because we just read that regarding Jacob. If you're going to apply that particular standard to Esau, then why don't we apply the same standard to Jacob? And not only that, she'afilu et shvachot hikdim levanav, that with Jacob it mentions that he preceded his handmaidens. With Esau it just talks about his wives. With Jacob it talks about his handmaidens as well as his wives. Kamosha Katuv, exactly what was written. Vayikach et shtei nashav, because it says he took his 2 wives and his 2 handmaidens, ve'et achadasar yeladav, v'hu pela. He says, and that's amazing. How do we deal with this? If you're going to apply that kind of standard, aval yesh lomar. So he says, but actually you can answer this difficulty. Yesh lomar tam ne'eman al ktimazo. He says there's actually a really good explanation for this, and I will just tell you. We'll look at the specific explanation, but remember, you've heard me say this so many times. Circumstances alter cases. And that's where we're going to go with this. And that's how we're going to explain this. Mishum, because Keshe'avar Yaakov et ma'avar Yabok, because what comes out of this is that when he crossed the ford of Yabok, Heiniach me'acharav b'machaneh. He had to leave behind him in the camp on the first side. Kol avadav v'chol machanehu. He had to leave all his servants and his camp. Sorry, it's talking about he transferred them to the other side. And he had to take all his servants and his entire encampment with him across to the other side. K'mevu'ah b'parsha, as is stated in the Parsha. V'chol zeh haya balayla. And we know this all took place at night. V'lachen huchrach lahavir mitchila et hanashim. Sorry. Again, I'm going back and forth on this as we're explaining this. Forgive me. I did prepare this, believe it or not. And so he says, since he took his, he had to leave his camp behind. We know this from the fact that he remained behind to clean up the camp. So he says he had to transfer initially his wives. Kedei shelo yutru levadam im ha'avadim, so that his wives wouldn't wind up by themselves with the servants, ve'im chayil hamachaneh, and with the army in the camp. Ulefize, and for this reason, of course he was concerned that if he was gone and these other people, these wives, were left with all these men, there was going to be a problem. Hayta kedima zo b'cheshbon. He says the reason why he took his wives first was it was calculated. V'da'at, and it was done with reason. He thought this through. V'tachlit nirtza likdusha, and a purpose that would be, in fact, something desirable in order to maintain holiness.
Rabbi,
One second.
I was wondering
Harlan,
about his
Harlan.
wives. His wives are Leah and Rachel. The others are concubines. They're not his wives.
Okay. Can I hold the question just a second, because I'm almost done here. Okay. Give me one.
Okay.
It just says, and see further Masha Katuv B'inyan Zer, regarding this matter, the Parshat Shmot in Exodus chapter 4:20. Okay, so Harlan, your point about the fact that Bilhah and Zilpah were concubines or handmaidens, what was the point you were trying to make there?
Well, you say his wives. I'm thinking all of them are his wives, but they're not his wives. My mind says, yes, they are his wives. And I say, well, he didn't marry them. He only married Leah and Rachel for 20 years, when he was 7 years for Leah and 7 years for Rachel. Was the bride, that's how he got the bride money. He was a poor man. He didn't have the bride money, so he had to work 7 years for Leah and 7 years for Rachel. But the others are not his wives. I always think they're his wives.
Okay, so they aren't concubines, and the reason we know they're not concubines is because each of them had 2 sons, and those sons inherited right along. They're part of the 12 tribes, and they have exactly the same status as all his other sons. And so if Bilhah and Zilpah were only concubines and nothing more than that, those sons would not have that status, that legal status, regarding inheritance or anything else. And the truth is, of course, is that Rachel initially gave, I believe, Bilhah to Jacob so that she could have children through him, through Bilhah, excuse me. And so, in fact, they were. So Bilhah was Rachel's handmaiden, and Zilpah was Leah's handmaiden. But they were given an additional level of a status because of that situation. But regardless, they were initially handmaidens. I've also read commentary that says they were actually half-sisters, that they were actually related in a sense. So again, how would you say the fact that they were concubines affects this interpretation that we're reading? Were you trying to say that or not?
No, I always think all of them were his wives. And then my mind says, no, he married only two two women. The others are not his wives, and yet they are his wives.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't think they're the concubines anymore. I don't know.
I
I'm
wouldn't
confused.
call them
What
concubines.
is the difference between A, a concubine, B, a mistress? Because when I've read it, I've thought, oh, this is how they do surrogate motherhood in that time.
Right. So, without having,
In order to have children.
right.
So it would not surprise me that those children would inherit because
Right. True. So, without having done any further research on this, the fact that they're called that Torah Tamima mentions them as handmaidens here that was their original, status. And as to whether or not, the point that Harlan's bringing up now, whether they had status of wives, which would mean, that they'd have conjugal rights, I have not read regarding that. So at this point, the way Torah Tamima is expressing it, it does sound as if they would not have the conjugal rights that Rachel and Leah would have had. But I'm not certain of that. Right now, it's simply a question. But it certainly is possible on the basis of this commentary that we're reading right now. But I can't imagine, I would hope that he would abuse the mothers of his children. So if those children had a full status, and even if they were used, they came into the relationship for surrogate purposes, that they're still human beings, and he needed to treat them that way. And quite possibly the fact that Abraham, according to tradition, Keturah and Hagar are one and the same person, and we know that after Sarah died, Abraham took Keturah, which means that he reconnected with Hagar, that there still is a commitment there from having that intimate relationship with these women. So I think, and you can also look at what Torah Tamima is saying here when he says, he points out that, while Esau, it says regarding that he put his wives first, and with Jacob it talks about his wives and his handmaidens, has, it's not so much a discussion about, whether they had conjugal rights or not, but simply the fact that they started off not being his wives, that they became related to him and had those relations with him for surrogate purposes, so that they, in a sense, had less of a status than wives. But it does require clarification. It does.
So what is known about, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Judy.
Well, what is known about handmaiden surrogacy, mistresses? I mean, are we talking Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings here? Are we?
It's a really good question, which I am not able to give you a full enough answer at this point. The only thing I can say is to reiterate what I told you before, and that is generally, if the woman had a status of a concubine, it meant her children would not inherit in the same way that children of a full wife would inherit.
I don't think Sally Hemings' kids inherited, did they?
Well, I can't. I don't know enough.
I don't remember. I don't think so, though. Yeah.
Right. So then she would be a concubine, clearly. Oops. Don't know what just happened there. Forgive me. Let's see. Okay. If I have, if you feel we can discuss this further, please just follow up. Judith, do you feel the question's been answered at least reasonably?
Yes, what I realize is I don't know the setting of it, and I realize it is a continuing interest to me, so I need to do further research on it.
Right. There is some.
I would say there's probably a difference as far as legitimacy of the relationship goes, because obviously it had to be a secret. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings had to be a secret,
Right.
and it was, and the offspring had to be, disavowed. Whereas in this case, it wasn't secret. It, you know,
Right.
whatever it wasn't secret. It wasn't shameful.
So I think that would answer the question of the difference between a mistress and a concubine. Although I suspect in France, having a mistress was something that was socially acceptable. So, but I think your point about social acceptability is a really good one. And generally speaking, when we're talking about a mistress, generally we're talking about something that would basically not be publicized, whereas a concubine was considered a legitimate legal status for a woman and a man to engage in. So,
Because first of all, monogamy was not
right.
required.
Correct.
So
It was not. It was not. Yeah. But
In my, oh, I'm sorry. In my mind, when Rachel couldn't have children, she said, well, maybe my maidservant could have a child with you, Jacob. It'll be a surrogate for me. It'll be a surrogate. It'll still be my child. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
well, and again, I think we're talking mainly about legal status, right? That the child inherits fully and not just does not have secondary status.
I mean, there's a lot of women can't have children, so they use another lady to have the child with the man's sperm. So I don't know, and it's their child.
Well,
It'll be a
again,
Jewish.
when you say it's their child, right? When we use that kind of terminology, does it mean that the woman gives them up? I don't get the feeling that Bilhah and Zilpah gave up their children for Rachel and Leah to take care of. I don't get that feeling. You know,
Oh,
I don't. Otherwise, yeah. I mean, I think there'd be other implications. Incidentally, by and large, of course, there is not a lot that is said about the nature of a relationship of a husband and a wife. There is stuff, but it doesn't go into deep details as to the nature of that relationship and the responsibilities, etc. I don't want to be misunderstood. There is much that is said in a way. I'm talking about more psychologically, from a psychological point of view. From a legal point of view, yes, yes. And also, I think there was, back in that particular culture and that particular time, the idea of being able to procreate was a very serious issue. And of course, I've heard it said, that having sexual relations, is it a matter of procreation or recreation? And I think that at least back in that time, it was primarily about procreation and not primarily about recreation. And I say primarily because it is considered important. That is, the recreation, quote, quote, element of it is also considered significant. So,
well, we tend to think of fertile or infertile as kind of black or white. It's either you are or you aren't.
yeah.
You're
Yeah.
either barren or you're fertile. Those are the only two possibilities. But maybe for them, there was something in between, like, well, I haven't given birth, but my maidservant has.
Right. Right. That there's a way for you to do it. But, I think there's such a tremendous difference. Again, I have to project that being able to bear your own child has to feel very different, even if you obviously can love that child and consider it your own in every other sense. But the fact that one is able to, that you're able to produce fruit through your body has to be a deeply, deeply significant issue, I would imagine, for those who would desire it. So back then, of course, we didn't have the kind of population that we do now. So the issues are different. I mean, in that sense, our cultures have changed considerably. We're going to go on to the point that actually Harlan was anticipating. So let's keep going. Okay. So we had this about the right. Vayar ki lo yachol lo, and this person saw that he wasn't able to overcome Jacob. He wasn't able to. Vayiga b'chaf yerecho, and so he touched the hollow of his thigh, the hollow of Jacob's thigh. Vateka kaf yerech Yaakov, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh, the thigh bone, in other words, was dislodged. Behe'avako imo, while he wrestled with him. So we'll get a little bit on this. I would actually like to stop right here, and so we will continue on Thursday. As best as I can tell right now, it will be Thursday with the Rashi. So I'm going to set it up here and plan on going right here on Thursday. I'm going to thank those who have been following the lesson through the recording, and hope I will see you very soon through this recording, and stop the share and stop the recording.